Welcome back to the Future Human Project. This is transmission number 2, and today's episode is all about narrative and mythos. So in this episode, this is something I've been wanting to talk about for quite a while here. I want to unpack my thoughts and share with you my perspective, coming again from a hypnotherapist background, from someone who has done a lot of spiritual study, who's done a lot of psychedelics. I want to share with you my thoughts on mythos and narrative and personal story, and both the strengths and the downsides of it, so that you're more aware of how to use narrative properly and why it's both important in this time and perhaps also something to be kind of really conscious and very finely tuned to. So let's go ahead and get into it. So before we go ahead and dive into the content here and start to unpack this a bit today, I wanted to just reintroduce myself for anyone who's new to the channel, new to my work, doesn't know me. My name is Dave. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining the conversation. And my background, just real quick TLDR here. I am a working coach. I'm a working hypnotherapist. I'm a working psychedelic therapist. I'm a trained guide. I have a long personal history of consciousness exploration, being involved in the conscious community, a big personal history of spiritual exploration, both with psychedelics and without. And Future Human Project here, this space is really a space for you and I and all of us to have a conversation together about what it means to be a healthy, fully alive, fully activated, thriving human being in the world that we're living in currently, in the world we're moving into. So how do we stay centered in our humanness in a high-tech world? That's kind of the core of what we're talking about here. And perhaps more broadly, an exploration into what it means to be a future human. That's kind of an open-ended concept by design, on purpose. I wanted to kind of throw out this provocative concept for us to explore together. What does this mean to be a future-facing human? So that's a little bit about me and about Future Human Project. Before we go ahead and get into the content, I want to just give a couple little updates here. First one being, I wanted to just kind of give us an apology up front here for not getting this content out sooner. I actually shot this video earlier this week and edited it all down, put it all ready to go here on YouTube, and then decided that the vibe was just off. My delivery wasn't great, and I was a bit uncentered, a bit kind of keyed up. And I realized that for this content, I really want to be transmitting from a certain place in myself, and I want to convey a certain vibe to you as an audience. So I figured it would be wiser for me to just pump the brakes on putting it out, reshoot it, and so here we are. So apologies for the delay in getting the video out to you. Just so you know, since this is all new content and a new space I'm creating, my intention here is to get a new video up every Monday or Tuesday, and also a Substack post up on those same days, either Monday or Tuesday. And the Substack post will be ahead of the videos. So whatever I post on Substack will be probably made into a video in subsequent weeks, whether it's the week after or a couple weeks after. And so you can kind of follow the Substack if you want the more cutting edge, immediate delivery of the content, or if you prefer to read, or if you like a more kind of long form spoken format like this and you like podcasts, that kind of a thing, then you can kind of wait for it to come out on video, and here we are. So that's what's going on with the content behind the scenes, and I'm really excited about this conversation. I really think that, for all my work in psychedelic therapy and all that I can talk about there, I think that looking at the implications of integrating all of this information together is really where the conversation needs to be had. It's what a lot of people are thinking about or trying to articulate. So I just want to make a bigger space to talk about things that are, again, beyond the scope of just psychedelic therapy or trauma healing or that kind of a thing. Okay, so with that being said, let's get into talking about narrative. Okay, so before we get into it here, I want to just kind of set this up by saying narrative, in my opinion, is a double-edged sword. Narrative is something that is deeply human. It is a core part of what it means to be a human being, is to create meaning and narratives. And at the same time, whether we wield meaning making, or narratives well, or whether we don't wield them very consciously and well, is all the difference between something very constructive or something very destructive. So I'm bringing this up as a part of kind of this foundation series of this first, I don't know how many posts yet, where we're going to be talking about some of the core themes that I think are kind of underscoring or kind of foundational concepts to what it means to be a clear, again, thriving, activated, fully alive human being. Okay. And meaning is at the heart of the human experience. So join me and let's talk about some of the different aspects of what it means to really hold and wield meaning making and narrative and mythos, whether we're talking collective mythology or personal mythology, well. So, as I just alluded to a moment ago here, it's my personal conviction and stance that a huge part of being a conscious being, to be fully integrated psychologically, spiritually, physically, emotionally, a huge part of that is about meaning making and narrative. Okay. When I went to my first personal development seminar a long time ago, back in the aughts, one of the things they said is that human beings are essentially meaning-making machines. And perhaps you've heard a similar cliche on, from Tony Robbins or whoever. And it really hit home how true that was after, by that point I'd spent, years and years and years in alternative spaces and psychedelic spaces and Burning Man and, underground raves and events, and deeply interacted with collective mythology firsthand from my own lived experience. And it really dawned on me how much the kind of meaning we live inside of shapes our perception of reality. And it became really clear when I heard that just how much we have an instinct and a need to assign meaning, in other words, to use our neocortex, this adaptive evolutionary advantage we have of the outer layer of the brain, to use that well to sort and organize and sense make of the world around us and all the swirling complexity and multi-layeredness of what it is to be alive, right? So the first thing I want to kind of set into this conversation of us together here is this idea that we are inherently meaning-making organisms. And so if we want to live consciously, if we want to be activated, clear, aligned human beings, that means we have to kind of maintain meaning making with like skill. We have to be intentional. We have to be self-aware of this drive as a human being. We have to be good with thinking. We have to be good with cognition and meaning making and understand, again, both the strengths, which is what we're going to unpack here in a moment, and the downsides. And, how to fit that into our lives in a really excellent way. Because real talk, the meanings you make and carry in your mind, and we'll get into this, from a therapy perspective, from a hypnotherapy perspective or a trauma therapy perspective, are a huge part of whether you're mentally healthy or not healthy, for example. And they shape your life profoundly. Okay. So this is a little bit of a heavy introduction here, but it's a bit of a heavy topic. It runs really deep into the human experience. So the post I made, I'm going to kind of pull from kind of the major flow of ideas in the post that I made. But if you want to get kind of my writing perspective on this, again, go check out the Substack. It's a bit of a different tone. Part of the idea here with the video and what this will be a podcast eventually, the idea is something a little more loose, a little more riff-based, a little more human, a little messier around the edges, but also clear in transmission, clear in vibe, right? So I may be a little more verbose here than I am in my writing. So, pick whatever format works for you depending on what you like to engage, okay? So let's start with the need for narrative. So as I was just saying, we are meaning-making machines, right? Or at least that's what I heard in my first personal development seminar. Other ways to think of this are that we live inside of narrative. We use narrative as a tool to make a coherent experience of reality. And if you've ever like done high level doses of psychedelics or something odd like ketamine, um, you'll start to see narrative really get abstracted. And that's really where we get kind of maybe a more raw and direct experience of life itself. It's probably more how a newborn experiences life, is just sensory data without any coherent connective meaning to like kind of pull that all together. So in terms of stability, in terms of clarity and well-being and presence, we live inside of narrative or story or mythos. So I'm going to use these terms fairly synonymously here, fairly interchangeably. Feel free to push back and, call me out if you think these are distinct, right? To me, they really correlate enough that we can kind of use them interchangeably. But we live inside of a narrative, and it gives us a sense of coherence with reality. So this is one of the first things I would invite you to start to think about, is how you live inside a narrative, and that you may not even be aware what that narrative is most of the time, and how we tend to confuse our narrative about reality for reality itself. In NLP, they would say that people don't have emotional responses to their direct experience. They have emotional responses to the meaning they make about their direct experience. And I think that's often true. Not always, but often. So we need narrative. And I think that's true in general for human beings. And I think part of what defines this era, right? Let's say from, the Y2K era to now, the first, 25 years of this century, what defines this early internet period in a lot of ways is the fragmentation of narrative that has come with the internet. This is a huge part of what we're struggling with here, is that it's hard to tell what's real, what's fake, what's true, what's false, what's right, and then we get into, the splintering of perception and the polarizing around the splintering of perception. And so in a very real way right now, we lack coherent narrative in our world. And certainly there are all kinds of different, institutions, actors, out there who would love to do the meaning making for us, right? But fundamentally, we are in a time, and part of the reason we're floundering right now is because we lack coherent narrative. And part of the intention here with the Future Human Project is to co-create, grassroots, person to person, bottom up, a shared narrative of what we are living through in this time to create a sense of coherence. So I want to be explicit with you here that I'm intentionally trying to weave a sense of connecting the dots between things so that we have a sense of narrative of what the heck we're experiencing right now. So I think there's a real need for narrative. And on that note, I want to just touch for a moment into some of the strengths of narrative, meaning making, story, however we want to think of this. And I want to just kind of hit upon some of the good parts of what this brings. So like I already said, it gives us a sense of coherence with reality. It also gives us a way to put some handle on the ungraspable in the world. Right? So a lot of times we perceive or subtly perceive things that are hard to define, vague impressions, trends, vibes, feelings, impressions, intuitions, however you want to think of that. I'm not just talking spiritual, and I'm not just talking in the woo-woo sense. I think every human being has this layer of experience where we get sensory data and impressions, but it's hard to pin down what it is we're perceiving exactly. Narrative helps to do that. It helps to put a handle on things and gives us it gives us language to start to work with these vague impressions. More importantly, narrative and story can integrate you, right? So it can tie things together. It can connect things, and it can integrate each of our psychology. Right. So I'm not huge on doing a lot of meaning making with my clients in my work, but there's clearly a need and clearly a thread of therapy and psychotherapy and psychology of meaning making being curative and restorative. I mean, certainly like if you watch Jordan Peterson's stuff, beyond his political stuff, just about meaning and story, this is huge, right? The idea of the logos, the divine masculine, the intellectual intelligence that connects and unifies sensory felt experience, that kind of a thing, right? So there's a real strength with narrative to kind of create cohesion and unification. And narrative can also, because of that, not only integrate you as a person, but us as people. So narrative creates culture, right? Cultures are often really about shared experience and shared value systems, and the stories and the narratives we use to either amplify or articulate or start to weave a shared understanding, right? So in a very powerful way, narrative is a conjoining, gluing, connective, binding force when used well. And that can really help, especially, again, in this time in the world where we're so fragmented. I think we need kind of a meta narrative of what's happening to start to connect things, not in like an overly tight way, but to give a sense of coherence that accounts for all the disparate things happening right now that are so wild and strange in our world. So narrative can unify. And I think that that's a really important thing to just kind of, put a little flag in and remember here that one of the strengths is unification. At the same time, I really want you to wrap your head around what I'm about to say here and look at this with me, okay? Narrative is always a construct. Okay, narrative, sure, is an attempt to describe perhaps a phenomenon or a situation or objective reality or experience, however whatever it is we are narrating, right? But through the act of using language and words and grammar and, concepts to articulate what are actually, objective phenomena or abstract phenomena into something coherent that we can communicate. That entire process, when we're creating a narrative, we are creating a construct. And that construct is, always going to be short of the real thing, right? There's a saying in NLP, for example, that the map is not the territory. And other ways that they might describe that is the menu is not the food, right? Or the symbol is not the thing it's symbolizing. And so narrative is a symbol of sorts. It is a construct. It is something we are building to describe something. And because it's a construct, it has limitations. It has places where it'll fall short. It's not always going to be one-to-one accurate, right? It's going to have biases and distortions and limitations. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But I really want you to wrap your head around the truism here and explore it for yourself. That narrative, as useful as it is, as unifying as it can be, also has real limitations, beginning with the fact that it is a construct and not direct experience. It is a symbol for direct experience. And this really brings us to looking at the other side of narrative. So the strength here, of course, again, is that it's unifying, right? But like I just said, it's a construct, and constructs fail. Constructs break down, and constructs can be misused. So let's talk a little bit about some of the dangers of narrative, because again, from my perspective, if we want to wield narrative in a skillful way as conscious beings, conscious participants of our own lives, conscious participants of a shared culture, for lack of a better term here, conscious participants of, embodying something sacred, something bigger than ourselves. If we want to really, really be fully activated human beings, we have to understand what it is that we're wielding, both in positive, how it can be used to the best of its ability, and also in the negative. What are the downsides? What are the dangers? Right? I think this is just kind of practically true of any tool, right? If I'm going to use a hammer I need to know what I can build with a hammer, but I also need to know how much I could hurt myself or someone else with a hammer. I think both are simultaneously true. So same thing here with narrative. And so let's get into some of the dangers. So the first one off the bat here is that when we're using and creating this construct of narrative, by the nature of attention, okay, because what is narrative? It is the use of language and storytelling to shape and direct attention via description, essentially, right? That's just off the top of my head here. Hopefully you get what I mean, though. One of the dangers of narrative is that when we're doing that, we are necessarily excluding data that might be relevant in the way we're describing it, right? So for any objective event or any story or experience, obviously there are an infinite set of points of view on that experience, right? There is the first person, there's the second person, the third person, and then there's like all the other the points of view. You know, if you imagine a camera floating in space in a scene in a movie, there are an infinite variety of places where that could be watching from and telling the story from the blades of grass on the ground, from the leaves of the trees, from the air, from a molecule, from a plant. I mean, it goes on and on. There's an infinite set of ways we can frame perspective and narrative. Now, whatever way we frame perspective or narrative will shape the way it seems, shape the meaning it has, shape the tone, shape the vibe. And so because of this, when we're telling a story, whether it's about ourselves or about the world or about each other, whatever, when we're telling a story, we're very much deleting information. And this is just the nature of mind and even the nature of vision. So I want you to follow the thread here. In order to put our attention on something, we have to exclude other data, right? So perhaps right now you're watching this video or just listening to the audio. You're hearing my voice. Maybe you're seeing me kind of talk and gesticulate and move. And while you're focusing on what I'm saying, there are other things you're not paying attention to, right? This is like a classic important piece of, say, hypnotherapy, but also just in general, you know, understanding how we work, right? So while you're focusing on this, there are other things about life or about your life or memories from the past or even embodied experiences you're having right now that you're not paying attention to, right? Let me give a very basic example. While we're talking, you're probably not thinking about the bottoms of your toes. But now that I mention it, you probably suddenly became aware of the bottoms of your toes. That's how attention works. When we're describing something, we're also excluding other things at the same time by definition. Okay, so when it comes to story and meaning making and telling story, that principle is always at play. There's data that's being deleted in order to carve out the shape of the story and kind of give you something to focus on, if that makes sense. Now, artists and storytellers of all stripes understand this well and use this, and this is part of the art of, say, filmmaking or writing or good music even. But we have to understand that the information that's being deleted could be important, could be relevant, could be a counterpoint that's important to consider in order to integrate. And so I know I'm kind of waffling on about this, but I want you to really wrap your head around this. Like, to use narrative is to be reductive in a certain sense while we're also articulating something, if that makes sense. Okay, enough about that. Let's move on to the next point here, which is we all know narrative can be used as a weapon. Whether it's someone, trash talking you in your own personal life, whether we're talking about governmental propaganda, whether we're talking, distorting, truth by telling half-truths or by adding spin to things, whether we're talking media manipulation or just storytelling to ourselves in a way that charges us with emotion that kind of winds up our own nervous system in a particular direction. Narrative and storytelling, I mean, it's at the heart of tribalism. It's at the heart of war. It's at the heart of conflict, right? We can't, tell a story that leads to conflict, without kind of doing that in a bias skewed way and weaponizing the storytelling. If we were holistic about the storytelling, it probably wouldn't lead to conflict most of the time, right? It's the lack of holism. It is the kind of filtering down that creates this charged thing. But yeah, narrative can be used as a weapon. And I think that's really important to understand, that as powerful as it can be, as good faith and honest and sincere as it could be, as co-creative as narrative can be to create, again, community and culture and civilizations and shared experience and shared ritual and deep shared beauty, it can also be used as a weapon. And narrative can be a way to feel like this. So I'm kind of jumping to the next point here. Narrative can make us feel like we have it all figured out. Oh, I know what that is. I know that story. I know that how that is. I know what happened. Right? It can be a way for us to radically oversimplify our understanding. And let's be clear, the human brain and the human body is designed to preserve calories. Okay, that's just evolutionarily wise. We didn't always have a source of food historically, so we need to preserve calories. And part of preserving calories is streamlining thinking and automating thinking into habitual behaviors or sets of assumptions rather than having to actively think all the time, because active thinking burns more calories. Okay, that's, as far as I know, literally true. It's not just some woo-woo hippie bullshit. So our brain is built to resist actively thinking as much as possible because it makes things just easier, biologically easier and also functionally easier, right? Now, because of that, part of how that shows up is this tendency to be like, oh, I know what that is. I have that figured out. I already know. And in that, we cut ourselves off from exploring the real truth. We disconnect from reality in a subtle way when we have that kind of attitude. That, for example, could be used to be deeply unfair to somebody else or to close off learning the whole story and, integrating that properly. There are a lot of ways which obviously that can start to go sideways, but most of all, it keeps you narrow and small and ignorant. So I want you to really think about that. Like, narrative can really be reductive and give us this feeling of like accomplishment and knowing and being in touch and being empowered when we're actually not. We're actually doing the opposite. And perhaps, moving on to the next point here, the most dangerous aspect of narrative is that it appeals to identity. Okay, narrative and identity are like a hand and a glove. So let me be explicit here. You may have never considered this before, and it took me a long time to wrap my head around this. And by the way, when I'm saying identity, we can use that if you're more spiritual and into spiritual ideas. We can use this idea as a proxy for ego. Okay, so identity and ego are maybe the same thing or very, very overlapped. And identity is built out of narratives. So remember what I was just saying earlier about attention and the way that in order to focus on something, we have to exclude other information. That's how we construct our identities, right? So if you think about it, there are experiences, memories, core beliefs, core conclusions, core life experiences that you use to construct your sense of self, right? That are cherry picked from the sum total of every life experience you've ever had. Right? Think of all the things that you've lived and experienced that you do not build an identity out of. They just pass through. That time you went swimming at the beach, that movie you watched maybe last week. How many people are building an identity out of the movie they watched last week? Probably a very small percentage of the total of people that watched a movie last week. So narrative, identity is built out of narrative. And therefore, narrative is appealing to identity inherently. Because, it is through narrative that we're going to update or augment our identity if we're going to. So when we're looking at all the dangers that ego and identity presents in terms of polarization and conflict and judgment and suffering and stress and fear and all the mental health struggles and social struggles, and again, from a Buddhist perspective, all the suffering that comes out of identity and identification and ego and sense of permanent self, all of that is fueled by narrative. And that's probably the most dangerous thing about narrative, is the way it is very seductive to identity. If you're, I don't want to talk too much about this because I don't want to fuel manipulation, but if you're a manipulative type of person or you're prone to wanting to do that, the obvious way to do that is through appealing to people's identity and using narrative to kind of massage identity in different directions to get the outcomes you want to get. That's how that's done, generally speaking. I'm sure you already, understand that or kind of intuitively perceive that. I'm going to leave that there because, again, I don't want to amplify that information, but let's just say that's very dangerous. The other thing here, I was just kind of hinting at earlier, I've kind of hinted at this a couple different ways, is that when we use narrative, when we use story and we use that as a proxy for real experience, we make a very real trade-off where we get a sense of solidity in life. Like narrative helps us to feel like things are stable and constant, and that's grounding and comforting for our nervous system. Okay. But the flip side of that is the trade-off is that we are letting go of the set of all the other possibilities of understanding, of perception, of feeling, of experience in order to have that condensed narrative experience. This is very much at the heart of what happens when we take psychedelics. At the core of the psychedelic experience, there are so many different ways you could slice and dice and describe that, but one way of describing it is the dissolution, right, of identity structures, again, which is the dissolution or the loosening up, at least, of your narratives. And what they do in a lot of ways is encourage you to either let go of a narrative or to reevaluate a narrative or to let that narrative be reviewed in a much more loose, casual way. This is a huge part of what psychedelics do, right? And because of that, that's how you end up accessing in these psychedelic states that sense of infinite possibilities, that sense of openness in life and fluidity and, oh, well, it could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this. And, and there's different ways that shows up for people on psychedelics, whether that's feeling playful and kind of loose and fluid and comical and free, to being deeply inspired and blown away by like the complexity of reality and what's actually possible, to sometimes being overwhelmed by all the options and all the, to glimpse that as a really deep thing. But there's freedom there. There's new possibilities there. And this goes hand in hand with mental health. So I want you to think about this with me. A lot of what defines negative mental health, this isn't the whole picture, but it's a good chunk of it, is rigidity in certain areas of our beliefs or emotions or memory or lived experience. And it's this rigidity, this lack of fluidity, that causes a lot of the suffering. The certainty that things are this certain way, or I'm like this, or this thing about me is true, or whatever the suffering is, right? There's different flavors and forms of that, and they're all built out of narratives. And those narratives occur to the person who's suffering as certain, as firm, as rigid, as true, as real. And it's that lack of fluidity that keeps them stuck in the suffering. And in a big way, this is, again, part of how psychedelics heal, is they open up that fluidity and we can reevaluate that certainty from different angles. And so this is, to zoom back out and come back around to narrative, one of the real trade-offs we make when we buy into a narrative really rigidly is we sacrifice possibility consciousness. And because of that, we often tend to suffer, especially if what we're certain of is something deeply negative or overwhelming or terrifying or something we can't integrate or don't know what to do with. That's generally how we end up with mental health struggles. Wow. It's funny. I'm just reflecting right now as I'm noticing my tone here. I reshot this because I didn't want to get so wound up, but here I am getting passionate again. Hopefully this lands for you guys. Hopefully this feels coherent. Let me know, leave a comment in the comment section or, rate it or whatever. It depends on where you're encountering this information. But let me know if this lands, if I'm being too emphatic here, too wound up. The point is, of course, to transmit clarity here, not necessarily to be intense, but here we are, here I am at least being a little intense. So noted. Another angle on narrative is that, just kind of continuing with that mental health angle here. A lot of times it is through narrative that people recirculate and recycle their suffering. Is through the story we tell ourselves over and over. Again, like let's say I've been through some trauma, and let's say I start to build a story about myself or about other people or about life itself overall based on what I've been through, right? Let's say I keep telling myself that same story, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, over and over for years and maybe decades. Again, narrative appeals to identity. That will start to build an identity for me around my trauma. So now I'm identified with my trauma because I've told this story over and over to myself, right? And because of that, people get really stuck in their story and again, confused and identified. And it's a really hard to get them disentangled from it because it means to heal the trauma means to let go of their identity. Right. And so this becomes really, really tough. It becomes quite a tangle. From a hypnosis point of view, that is self-hypnosis. Self-hypnosis is really just the repetition of, either something you repeat something a lot of times, or you say something that has emotional impact deep enough until the body starts to believe it as true. That's what self-hypnosis is. And so, in a very real way, when a person is telling a story and identifying with it over and over and over, they're self-hypnotizing. So all of this to say in this section is that narrative can be very dangerous. Storytelling can be very dangerous. We have to be self-aware, not only personally, like I'm illustrating here, but also collectively in the way that stories are told and shared and communicated, what narratives are woven, and whether or not we want to subscribe to them and align and agree with them or not. Okay? With that being said, we have to wield narrative. Because if we don't take control of narrative and wield it skillfully, others will wield it for us and they'll use it for their advantage. They'll use it for their own purposes, which may or may not align with what you want for yourself or what we think is healthiest for all of us, right? So let's be clear that narrative is, again, a double-edged sword. It can heal, it can unify, it can create culture, it can also wound and abstract and distort reality. And we have to be self-aware of that and really wield that on our own. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about how narrative is a sacred technology of sorts, and then we'll wrap the video. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how narrative is a sacred technology of sorts, and not at all a new sacred technology, but still a sacred technology nonetheless. Okay, so from my point of view, and again, in this space, in this, whatever podcast or this container I'm creating here, I want to have a conversation with you guys about what it means to be a future human. This isn't just about me and my opinions and some dumb, brand or cult of personality bullshit. This is a space for us. Okay. So to me, a future human is someone who probably doesn't reject narrative and story, but uses it consciously. Right. So just weaving mythos and mythology. And, if you're someone who's been in the conscious community and you've been around people who get all into this fantasy about who they are and their personal story and their personal history and mythologizing that, I went through that. I've seen a ton of my friends go through that. I'm very familiar with that. That ultimately can be just very self-indulgent and not really do much except maybe give you like a comfort blanket for your life, right? Even if there's truisms there and wisdom there and a thread of narrative there, it doesn't work. But also, like being a postmodernist who just says, well, nothing means anything and there's no meaning in anything and everything is just what it is, or it's all just subjective, that also doesn't work, right? That just ends up deconstructing everything. And then we're just left with a soup of messiness. But as human beings, our instinct is to make meaning out of things. So it's really hard for people to be in a space of non-meaning. You have to be pretty much an advanced meditator to sit in that kind of place and just not let anything mean anything and have that be clean. So postmodernism doesn't work. Clinging to narrative doesn't exactly work either. We've got to, as future humans, wield narrative intentionally, use it, but use it intelligently and consciously and gently. So from my perspective, the wisest thing you can do, and I mean this in terms of, again, from a therapeutic angle, from a spiritual angle, from a personal development angle, however you want to think of this, I think the wisest thing we can do with story and narrative and meaning making is to hold it loosely, right? To hold it, to wield it, to use it, but to hold it loosely. To be, in other words, willing to redefine the story, to tell a different story, to let go of narrative altogether if we are misperceiving at any moment. In other words, to be able to adjust and realign our perception rather than clinging to our narrative as truth and being confused about reality and narrative. I think to be like a truly sovereign, liberated, actualized being is to recognize that story is a key tool. It is a deep part of being human. It is something that other human beings resonate with, and therefore you'd be wise to use it to align, to unify, to connect, to bring coherence, to bring connectivity and resonance to things. But the moment it becomes binding or rigid or toxic or starts to wound or be a disservice to anyone, let it go. Let it go. So that's my stance on meaning making. It's deep, it's human, it offers real upside if we're intelligent about it, but it also offers real downside that if we're not self-aware of can really be damaging either personally or collectively. And I think we've seen a lot of that. I think that narrative is something that if we use skillfully as a community, as a culture, as a civilization, we can find deep, deep beauty and resonance in. But we also have to be willing to let go of our story, let go of our narrative, see it from a different perspective, see it from a different angle, reconcile new understandings and integrate that in so that we're not just rigidly holding to an old narrative, and remain flexible with it. And if we can do that, I think meaning has a real place in our world and in our lives without becoming the destructive force that it can be. So that's my thoughts on this for now. What would mean a lot to me before we wrap the video here is if you could leave a comment if this resonated for you, if you could leave a like. If you want to subscribe, please, would love to have you aboard, but again, no pressure, it's chill. And also, if you could do me a favor, let me know if this long form is too long form. Do you want a shorter episodes here, more like 20 minutes? Or if these kind of expansive, but, passionate risks that I'm sharing here are landing for you as meaningful or helpful. That would really help me if you could give that feedback. All right. Much love to you, whoever you are. Thank you for being here in this space with me. Thank you for taking this in. Would love to know your thoughts. Again, this is a conversation, so please offer your thoughts back. This is a dialogue. It's not just the Dave show, okay? Much love to you all, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.